In this lesson, we'll be creating solid bodies from sketches. After completing this lesson, you'll be able to use Extrude, Revolve, Fillet, Press, Pull, and Combine, as well as demonstrate how to edit a timeline. With some of our basic concepts of sketching out of the way, we want to talk about how to turn these sketches into solid bodies. And there are many different options, and again, we will explore these options as they become necessary through our courses. But we want to make sure we understand the process of how to turn these sketches into solid bodies first. We're going to continue on with the file we created for our basic sketching practice. Now, if you've already closed this file, you can expand your data panel, and you should see the file there located in whichever subfolder you created. To open this file, you simply need to double left click, and it'll open inside of your canvas. Inside of here, you'll notice in our browser, we now have the name of our file at the top. We have our named views and origins, which were already there, and then we have a sketches folder that shows sketch 1. You also notice it has a little red pin icon, and that's because we grounded it to the origin and everything's fully defined. We can right click on this sketch and we can do things like redefine a sketch plane, we can edit, we can even export it as a DXF, and various show and hide options. We can also left click on it again, and we can rename the sketch. And this is a great idea for organizing your files, especially when you start to get into more complicated designs and if you're collaborating with other users. For right now, we're not going to worry too much about renaming any sketches or features, but I just do want to note that that is an option, and we can do that directly here in the browser. I also want to note in the timeline at the bottom, we see sketch 1. You'll see that it says Basic Sketching Practice V1 underneath it, and V1 is version 1 that was created when we saved our file. The only thing we have in this file is this sketch, so there's nothing else to show in the timeline just yet. But we're going to change that by creating an extrude. We're going to do this from our Create menu, and we're going to select the Extrude option. You'll notice that as we hover our cursor over a tool for a little bit, we get a tooltip. It shows us Extrude as well as the shortcut key if there is one, and it tells us exactly what this tool does. Same thing if we hover over Revolve, for example. It shows a graphic and it gives us an idea of what this tool does. And this is very helpful, especially if you don't have a firm grasp exactly of what these tools do. We're going to get started by first looking at the Extrude option. So we're going to left click on Extrude, and then we have our properties that display on the right hand side of our canvas by default. Now here we first need to select a profile, and in our case we're going to left click on the circle. As soon as we do that, a few things pop up on the screen. An arrow, this manipulator, and a dialog box with a value in it. If we drag the arrow up, you can see that we're creating this geometry in positive or negative directions. If we grab this manipulator, we're changing the draft angle of the walls. And we can manually enter these values. By left clicking on them, you see that we change from a distance. And if we activate this one, we change to a taper degree. So these are the various options that we see when we're doing an extrude. You'll also notice that we have properties such as where to start the extrude. And we're going from the profile plane, which is where our sketch is, but we can also offset that a certain distance or select another object we want to start from. We can change the direction, one side, two sides, which allow us to give a value of different amounts in different directions, or a symmetric. We can change whether or not the length is the entire length, or if it's the half length. And we can also change whether or not the extents are distance, all, and there are some other options that show up depending on the type of operation and what other geometry we have available. We can determine whether or not this is going to create a new body, or if we have other solid bodies in our file, we can join, remove material, or just keep the intersection between solid bodies. We also have this option at the bottom called New Component, which we'll get to in a little bit. For right now, let's not worry about it. We're going to use the New Body option, and we're going to say OK, and now we've created a solid body. You'll also notice by default the sketch is now hidden. If we want to show it again, we can go ahead and left click on that light bulb icon, and this brings it back for us. The next thing that I want to do is I want to explore the Create option, Revolve. I'm going to left click on Revolve, and for the profile I'm going to select my rectangle. Notice that we have different options for Revolve than we did for Extrude. We now need to select an axis of revolution. Now this can be one of our default axes, such as X, Y, or Z. We can also select one of the edges of our sketch itself. Sometimes if your selection is inside of another body, you might want to use some of our selection tools. There are filters, as well as priorities that we can turn on and off. We also have the option to simply hold down the left mouse button, and that'll bring up an option for anything else that we can select through the geometry. Now in this case, we're going to use the Z-axis. Now as we do this, you'll notice that on the screen the preview is red, and the operation is set default to cut. And this is because we're creating new solid geometry, and Fusion 360 knows that it's going through other solid geometry. So it knows that we might be trying to remove that. Now, however, if we want to add it, we can simply go to Join, and then we'll join the two solid bodies together. We can also come in and say, well, we just want to keep the intersection of those. So our preview changes from red to yellow, and you can see it shows the solid regions that are going to be left behind. We can also simply just create a new solid body. In this case, we want to use the New Solid Body option and say OK. Then I want to hide my sketches and expand the Bodies folder. We now have Body 1, which was the original body we created with our Extrude, and Body 2, which is our Revolve. If we take a look in the timeline, we now have our sketch, Extrude 1, and Revolve 1. So as you can see, we're starting to see features populate this timeline, and at some point in time, we might want to decide that this Revolve needed to happen before the Extrude. We might also decide that we want to drag the end of our timeline and focus on certain things. Maybe we want to add more features to this before we got into that Extrude. We can go to our Modify section, for example, and add a fillet. We want to add a fillet to the outside by selecting two edges and simply dragging this arrow or manually entering a value. Again, just like all the other features and sketch options, there are many things that we can change in here. For example, we can use a rule fillet that allows us to do things like select a feature or a face and create some rules and how fillets are going to be applied. We can also change the type of fillet if we want to have a curvature continuous fillet or use tangency. We can also change the type of radius. For example, we can use a chord length or a constant radius. And we can also select the corner type. Now in this case, we're not dealing with a corner, for example, where we have three edges joining, but we do have some options there as well. We're going to say OK, then take the end of the timeline and drag it back, and again our solid body comes back. There are many different tools in here, but the main focus that I want to make sure we understand is how to take a sketch into a solid feature, and also the access point for these tools. We have the Create section, which allows us to do things like Extrude and Revolve, which we've already looked at. But we also have Sweep and Loft, which are common tools. And we have other things in here, such as ribs and webs, which are very helpful for certain types of geometry, such as injection molded plastics. We have hole creation and thread creation. We have some primitives that allow us to quickly define things like boxes and cylinders and spheres. And then we have various tools such as the creation of patterns or mirrors. We also have a Modify section where we use things like fillets and chamfers. But we can also do things such as shell and draft and scale and combine. The Combine tool is similar to what happens inside of an operation where we can join, remove, or keep the intersection of solid geometry. Let's take a quick look at the tool Press Pull. Now Press Pull is very handy. We can select this upper face of our cylinder and we can drag it, and notice how it's behaving. When this extrude was originally created, we used the symmetric option. So when we're dragging this upper face, it's also moving the bottom face down because that history is maintained. You'll also notice when we OK, no new features are added because it was able to change the feature by simply updating the dimension. If we use this by taking a look at the diameter of that and we drag it out and say OK, notice it now created something new. The reason it created something new is because this sketch was fully defined and it wasn't able to go back and modify that, so it had to create a new feature to offset those faces externally. At this point in time, if we want to combine things, we can use the Combine option, and we have it set to Join, and we're going to join the upper and lower bodies together and say OK, And now in our bodies folder, we have one single body left behind. So these are many various options where we can use our sketch geometry to create solid bodies, and then we can use some of the modification tools to do things like add fillets, use press pull to change the diameter of our cylinder, and then ultimately use combine to join them together. Everything is captured in the timeline at the bottom of our screen. You can see everything here, and at any point in time we can decide to roll this back to an earlier point. We can do things like right-click and suppress these features or delete them altogether if we need to. There are many other features that we haven't covered here. This is just the basic introduction to how we work with sketches and taking them into solid bodies. And again, this is just a practice. If we want to save this file as our basic sketching practice, all we need to do is select Save and say OK. And now we've created a new version. If we expand our data panel, we see that we have V2, and if we left click on that, our original version just contains our sketches, and our V2 contains all of our solid bodies. At any point in time, we can go back and open the older file, or we can promote it to be the most current. And again, these are more advanced options. We're not going to get too deep into these just yet, but just note that everything we've done is saved at the version level. So we can make all kinds of changes, and if we decide we ever need to go back for some reason, we don't have to delete and remove all of that information. We can simply go back to that older version and retain all that history. From here, make sure you save the file. Once you're comfortable with what we've covered here, go ahead and move on to the next step.